The music world is reeling after a devastating blow has struck Ozzy Osbourne at the age of 76. He once said, "The past 4 years have been sheer hell for me. My health has been in a terrible state." This is a man who has endured pain and tragedy far beyond what any ordinary person could survive. Parkinson's disease stole his legs, a brutal accident shattered his spine, and countless wounds remain, too deep and unspeakable to name. And yet, at 76, Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, is now facing a challenge even more agonizing than all he has suffered before. What has just happened to Ozzy Osbourne will shake you more than you can possibly imagine. Before the roaring crowds, before the blazing lights, before the legend of the Prince of Darkness was etched into music history, there was only silence. A silence so heavy, it threatened to crush the soul of a boy who didn't grow up to dream. He grew up to survive. In the grey slums of Aston, Birmingham, a young John Michael Osbourne, born in 1948, lived in a house too small for 6 children and 2 exhausted parents. His father, hardened by factory life, believed emotion was weakness. His mother, worn down by the assembly line, didn't have time for softness. Ozzy, as he came to be known, wasn't the loud one or the clever one. He was the forgotten one. School offered no refuge. Letters danced cruelly on the page. Numbers blurred into each other. Dyslexia in the 1950s was a mystery. To teachers, he was simply dumb. To his classmates, he was the perfect target. The bullying wasn't just verbal. It was fists, kicks, bloodied noses in alleyways, and no adult ever asked why. It was cruelty without pause, a gauntlet of humiliation repeated day after day. At home, things weren't kinder. One day, when he dared to cry from the pain of another beating at school, his father gave him one more, with a belt. "Pain didn't get you sympathy," Ozzy would later say, "it got you punishment." There was no comfort, no safe place, only a silence that screamed. By 1962, at age 14, the silence had become unbearable. In a tiny, dimly lit bedroom, he tied a rope using his mother's washing line, climbed onto a chair, and waited for the world to let go of him. But fate had other plans. His father burst through the door in time to stop it, not with compassion, but with rage. The boy who didn't want to live was beaten again, as if pain could cure despair. Something inside him broke that day, or maybe it finally hardened. He stopped trying at school, stopped speaking unless necessary. He drifted through life with the numb detachment of someone who expected nothing more. The laughter of other children became a foreign language. He looked in the mirror and saw a ghost with living eyes. In 1963, at age 15, he dropped out. No direction, no skills, no plan. He took whatever job he could find: slaughterhouse worker, construction helper, horn tuner at a car factory, but nothing fit. He was too clumsy, too distracted, too angry, and always too broken. Each job ended the same: fired, forgotten, alone. By then, Ozzy was running out of air, not just in his lungs, but in his life. Every door had closed. No job would keep him. No adult would believe in him. Hunger clawed at him, real, physical hunger that made the walls of his home feel like a prison of hopelessness. His shoes were worn through, his clothes barely held together, and his spirit was unraveling at the seams. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, only the echo of everyone who'd told him he was nothing. In a moment of quiet despair, with no future and no food, desperation didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. Desperation led to crime. In 1965, at age 17, a botched clothing store robbery landed him in Winson Green Prison. There, surrounded by real criminals, he realized just how far he'd fallen. In one brutal night, he was attacked by another inmate. He fought back the only way he knew how, with a metal chamber pot. It wasn't justice, it was survival. But somewhere, buried under the trauma, there was still a spark. And then one day, that spark was lit. The Beatles' She Loves You came on the radio, a lightning bolt to his soul. For the first time, he didn't just want to escape life. He wanted to live it, loudly, madly, unapologetically. Ozzy later said, "That moment changed me. I didn't know how to play an instrument, but I knew I had to be on stage. I had to scream louder than the pain inside me. That scream would become his weapon, his anthem." This wasn't the beginning of his success, not yet, but it was the moment he decided he wouldn't die a forgotten boy in Birmingham. The stage would be his salvation, and chaos, oddly enough, would become his language of survival. He would go on to lose everything, to break, to bleed, to burn. But the boy who once tried to disappear into silence would one day have the whole world screaming his name. And that is how legends are born. Not in peace, not in comfort, but in the ashes of despair, where pain is loud enough to echo through time. The shadows of his troubled youth had barely begun to lift when something extraordinary pierced through the silence of despair. A sound, a calling that would anchor his soul for decades to come. Ozzy Osbourne, newly released from Winson Green Prison in 1965 at just 17, wasn't searching for redemption. He was simply drifting through a world that had already decided he wouldn't matter. His 6-week sentence for robbing a clothing store, a desperate act of survival more than crime, hadn't taught him any lessons, only confirmed his worthlessness in the eyes of society. He walked out of that cell, not reformed, but more fractured than ever. And then a miracle came, not in the form of a savior, but a song. When he heard the Beatles' She Loves You crackle through a cheap radio speaker, it was as if the world cracked open. It was like hearing God speak to me through music, he later remembered, his voice distant, almost tearful. That moment didn't erase the bruises on his back or the fear in his bones, but it gave him a vision. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to make music, not polished music, not perfect music, but music that screamed. By 1968, that scream had found its echo. A modest newspaper ad seeking a vocalist led him to a rundown rehearsal room in Birmingham, where he met 3 other haunted men. Tony Iommi, a guitarist whose missing fingertips couldn't blunt the fury in his riffs. Geezer Butler, a bassist whose fascination with the occult gave their sound its unease. And Bill Ward, a drummer who played like thunder trapped in human skin. They called themselves Earth at first, but the horror film Black Sabbath inspired a revelation: fear sells. So why not embody it? As Ozzy once said, if people pay to be scared, why not give them music that terrifies and moves them? They weren't trying to be stars. They were trying to summon something raw, something that clawed at the dark corners of the human experience. Their songs weren't entertainment. They were rituals. On Friday, February 13th, 1970, they released their self-titled debut album. The date alone seemed like an omen. Critics recoiled in disgust, calling it satanic, repulsive, a desecration of music. But on the streets, in bedrooms where alienated youth buried their pain, Black Sabbath was an awakening. That same year, their second album, Paranoid, was born almost accidentally, written in just days, but it became scripture for the wounded. Tracks like War Pigs, Iron Man, and the eerie title song weren't just hits. They were war drums for a generation choking on silence. Ozzy's voice, imperfect, untrained but possessed, didn't need polish. It needed pain. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew it had to be loud, he admitted. That loudness wasn't just volume, it was defiance. Ozzy never learned to read music. He had no training, but his voice carried agony like an open wound. He wailed for every boy who was told he'd never be enough, every misfit who thought they were alone. He wasn't performing, he was bleeding. Behind the stage persona, behind the myth of the madman, still lived the terrified kid from Aston, the one who once tried to end it all in silence and now shouted through amplifiers so that silence would never win again. Those early years weren't just the birth of heavy metal. They were Ozzy's rebirth, rising not from ashes, but from dirt, blood, and sheer will. He didn't craft a genre. He clawed one into existence. And as the world began to call him a legend, he still felt like a runaway screaming into the void. But that scream changed the world. It built more than music. It built myth. It built memory. It built a legacy forged in torment. And somehow, resilience. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy Osbourne stood on the summit of heavy metal glory. But beneath the roaring crowd and blinding stage lights, his soul was quietly crumbling. The same voice that once pierced the silence of a generation was now being drowned out by inner demons no spotlight could reach. Black Sabbath had become a global phenomenon, pioneers of a sound that felt like thunder and spoke to the outcasts, the broken and the angry. But for Ozzy, the louder the music grew, the more deafening his emptiness became. Behind closed doors, he was unraveling, gripped by a storm of destructive habits, haunted by childhood wounds that had never truly healed, and numbed by the crushing weight of fame. Album after album, like Paranoid in 1970 and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath in 1973, elevated the band to iconic status. But Ozzy was slipping into shadows even the stage lights couldn't chase away. His bandmates began noticing the missed rehearsals, the incoherent ramblings, the spark dimming behind his wild eyes. Tony Iommi, once his brother in riffs, grew cold. The air between them thickened with unspoken blame and exhausted silence. Then, in 1979, came the final betrayal. They fired him. Not face to face, not with dignity. They sent someone else to do it. Ozzy would later recall, with the weight of abandonment in his voice, "They didn't even have the balls to tell me themselves. That was my band." It wasn't just a career shattered. It was a sanctuary torn from him. Black Sabbath was more than music to Ozzy. It was the one place where chaos made sense, where his brokenness became power. Without it, he was exiled, discarded like a warning label. He disappeared into a Los Angeles hotel room, curtains drawn, soul drowning. "I just sat in that room," he would later confess. "I numbed myself until I couldn't feel anything. I thought I would fade away in that silence." To the outside world, he was still Ozzy Osbourne. But in that room, he was a fading echo of himself, a ghost with a pulse. But legends don't vanish, they transform. And in Ozzy's darkest hour, something stirred in the ashes. Sharon Arden, daughter of Sabbath's former manager, saw more than a fallen icon. She saw a man not yet finished. She pulled him from the wreckage and whispered the impossible. "You were the magic in that band. You can do this without them." Her faith struck like lightning against wet stone. Then came Randy Rhoads, young, disciplined, and unearthly in his talent. His guitar didn't just play, it wept, soared, and screamed. To Ozzy, Randy was not just a bandmate, he was a lifeline. Together, they built Blizzard of Oz, released in 1980, an album forged not in celebration, but in survival. Songs like Crazy Train weren't just anthems, they were resurrections. Each lyric, each chord, a defiance. I am still here. I still matter. Looking back, the collapse wasn't the ending. It was the crucible. Ozzy had to be broken beyond recognition to uncover the raw, resilient fire inside. And though the road ahead would be marred with loss, grief, and battles that would leave deeper scars than fame ever could heal, this was the moment his spirit roared loudest. In his own words, "I was out of control. But somehow, I kept going. I always kept going." The bond between Ozzy Osbourne and Randy Rhoads wasn't merely musical, it was spiritual, salvational, almost celestial in nature. Randy didn't just step into Ozzy's life with a guitar. He arrived like a light piercing through a suffocating storm. For Ozzy, still reeling from the humiliation of being cast out of Black Sabbath and clinging to sanity by mere threads, Randy was proof that there could still be beauty, discipline, and purpose in a world that had grown cruel and meaningless. Randy's youth wasn't reckless, it was focused. His creativity didn't erupt in chaos like Ozzy's, but instead flowed like fire through glass, shaped and precise. Together, they weren't just creating music, they were building salvation in sound. When they released Diary of a Madman in 1981, it wasn't just a follow-up album, it was a defiant declaration. Ozzy, once discarded as damaged goods, now stood again as a force reborn, and it was Randy who helped carve that path. Ozzy once said, "Randy wasn't just a guitar player, he was my friend, my little brother, and the only reason I didn't give up." The connection ran deeper than melodies. It was the heartbeat that sustained Ozzy through a fragile rebirth. On stage, they were electric. Ozzy, raw and unhinged, and Randy, controlled and transcendent. Off stage, they were laughter and philosophy, late-night talks and mutual respect. Ozzy was in awe, not just of Randy's talent, but of his soul. He had this grace, Ozzy recalled, like he knew he didn't have forever, so he made every note count. There was an unspoken urgency to their collaboration, a shared understanding that lightning doesn't strike twice, and when it does, you honor it, but storms never last. And somewhere deep down, in the calm before devastation, Ozzy would later admit he felt it, that eerie stillness before fate decides to be cruel again. They were flying too high. It wouldn't last. And when it broke, it wouldn't crack gently. It would shatter everything. On the morning of March 19th, 1982, the nightmare Ozzy never saw coming arrived with the silence of a scream trapped in the throat. While on tour in Leesburg, Florida, the band made a routine stop at a property owned by their bus driver. There, a small private plane sat idle, a toy of temptation. On a restless morning, the driver, a licensed pilot, decided to take it for a joyride. Randy Rhoads, always curious and calm, climbed aboard with makeup artist Rachel Youngblood. It was meant to be harmless, a loop in the sky, a bit of thrill before the next long drive. Ozzy stood below, watching, smiling faintly, perhaps already haunted by a shadow he couldn't name. The plane made 2 passes, but on the third, the unthinkable happened. A wing clipped the band's tour bus. In an instant, the aircraft spiraled, plummeted, and erupted into flames upon impact. Randy Rhoads was gone, 25 years old, a comet extinguished in daylight. Ozzy ran toward the wreckage, screaming Randy's name until his voice cracked and broke. The flames weren't just fire, they were finality. He collapsed beside the wreck, shaking, weeping, unable to comprehend what lay in front of him. For hours, He was inconsolable. For days, he couldn't speak, and for weeks, he lived in a blur of numb disbelief. "I lost a part of myself that day," he said later. "It wasn't just Randy's body in that fire. It was my hope, my music, my reason to keep breathing." The man who had been pulled from ruin by a friend was now dragged back into darkness by fate. And this time, the fall felt bottomless. Even Sharon couldn't reach him at first. The shows were cancelled. The laughter stopped. The house went quiet. It was as if the universe itself had silenced the melody. Randy's death didn't just break Ozzy, it hollowed him. And though time would force him to keep walking, a part of his soul forever remained in that burning wreck. On that unforgiving morning in March, Ozzy watched in horror as a small plane carrying Randy exploded in a fireball before his eyes. In that instant, a piece of Ozzy died too. For weeks, he vanished into silence, unable to speak, unwilling to eat, drowning himself in alcohol just to numb the loss. He later said, "Losing Randy was like losing a part of my soul. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to play music. I didn't want anything." It wasn't just grief. It was emotional paralysis. Sharon, once his lifeline, struggled to reach him. Even she admitted, "I thought I'd lost him forever." But from the wreckage of that despair, something unexplainable began to stir. Ozzy began to write again, not to move on, but to remember. Every lyric, every scream into the mic became a tribute to the friend he would never forget. Though the pain would never fade, Ozzy knew he had to carry the music forward, not just for the fans, not even for himself, but for Randy. His survival became a form of defiance, and every show that followed carried the weight of a legacy built in tragedy. He wasn't healed, but he was moving, and for Ozzy Osbourne, that meant he was still alive. You'd think the worst was behind him, that surviving the unthinkable would teach the soul how to heal. But grief doesn't follow logic, and for Ozzy Osbourne, the years after Randy Rhoads' death weren't about recovery. They were about a descent into a private darkness that very nearly consumed him. The 1980s rolled on, but for Ozzy, they were a blur of numb days and tortured nights. Each tour was a parade of chaos, every hotel room a battlefield of broken bottles and regret. The music still played, but the man behind the microphone was unraveling. Audiences saw a wild man with eyeliner and a bat-biting reputation, but backstage, he was a ghost of himself, drifting, volatile, unreachable. Sharon tried everything. She had pulled him from oblivion once, and she refused to give up, but love alone couldn't keep him grounded. As Ozzy later confessed in a trembled voice, "I was spiraling. I wasn't even present in my own life." By 1987, his drinking had reached an apocalyptic level, and pills